On the night of July 29th, American strikes hit a home on Keshum Island again. A father, a mother, and their 2-year-old son were killed. 2 more children, 7 and 9 years old, were wounded. This wasn't the first time Keshum had been hit in this war. It wasn't the second or the third. It was at least the 6th confirmed round of strikes on this exact island since the war began in February. And that repetition is the actual story tonight, because Keshum isn't just another town getting caught in a wider war. It's the anchor of Iran's entire defensive perimeter around the Strait of Hormuz, and the pattern of strikes hitting it over and over across 5 straight months tells you something bigger is happening to Iran's grip on that waterway than any single night of bombing could show on its own. Think about what it means for one specific island to keep coming up, strike after strike, across 5 months of a war that's hit dozens of different locations throughout the country. If Keshum were just an unlucky, randomly targeted location, you'd expect the strikes there to look scattered, disconnected from any larger pattern. Instead, every single confirmed round of strikes on this island lines up almost perfectly with a broader escalation in the fight over who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz itself, which is exactly why this island functions as a kind of barometer for the whole war's trajectory, not just its own local story. Here's what's coming. We're going to explain exactly why Keshum matters strategically, because most coverage treats it as just another location on a map, rather than what it actually is, the cornerstone of a defensive concept Iran itself has spent years building. We're going to walk through every confirmed round of strikes on this island, month by month, because the frequency itself tells a story. We're going to break down the actual blockade numbers, vessels redirected, vessels disabled, and what those numbers mean for who's actually controlling traffic through this strait right now. And we're going to end with the most recent exchange from just days ago, including a claim from Iran that deserves real scrutiny rather than automatic acceptance. So stick with me. Let's start with why Keshum actually matters, because you can't understand the significance of these repeated strikes without understanding the concept Iran itself built around this exact stretch of islands over the course of many years, long before this specific war ever began. According to CNN's reporting from mid-July, researchers at Sun Yat-sen University in China have documented that Iranian officials refer to a specific group of 7 islands: Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, Lesser Tunb, Hengam, Keshum, Larak, and Hormuz, as Iran's arch defense regarding the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian officials themselves have described these same islands as Tehran's stationary and unsinkable aircraft carriers. According to that same research, a phrase that captures exactly how central this specific piece of geography is treated within Iran's own military and strategic thinking. Keshum isn't just part of that arch. It's the largest island in the entire Persian Gulf, positioned directly along the narrowest, most critical stretch of the strait that roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through every single day, making it arguably the single most consequential piece of territory in this entire war outside of Iran's mainland itself. That framing, an unsinkable aircraft carrier, tells you exactly how central this island is to Iran's entire military concept for controlling the strait. An aircraft carrier that can't be sunk because it's actually solid ground, gives you permanent basing for radar, coastal missile batteries, and naval assets without any of the vulnerability an actual ship would have. Losing effective control over even one island in that arch weakens the entire chain, and losing repeated rounds of strikes against the largest, most strategically positioned island in that chain is a considerably bigger problem than losing a single isolated skirmish somewhere else in the country. It's worth understanding the geography here a little more precisely too, because it explains exactly why this specific island carries so much more strategic weight than its size alone might suggest to someone unfamiliar with the region. Keshum sits directly across from the narrowest navigable channel ships must pass through to enter or exit the Persian Gulf, close enough to the shipping lanes that any radar, missile battery, or coastal defense system based there has a direct, largely unobstructed line on vessels transiting that exact channel. That's fundamentally different from a defensive position located somewhere further inland, which would need to rely on longer-range systems and less precise targeting data. A base on Keshum doesn't need to reach out across long distances to threaten shipping in the strait. It's already sitting essentially on top of the choke point itself, which is exactly why Iranian military planners built so much of their coastal defense concept around holding this specific island securely. That geographic reality also explains why repeated American strikes here carry more strategic weight than the same number of strikes scattered randomly across the country would. Every round of strikes that degrades Keshum's radar coverage, its command and control infrastructure, or its coastal missile capability doesn't just remove one isolated asset. It specifically widens the gap in Iran's ability to threaten or monitor exactly the stretch of water where the blockade enforcement, the vessel redirections, and the broader contest over the strait are actually taking place. In other words, these strikes aren't just punishing Qeshm, they're systematically clearing the specific obstacle that would otherwise give Iran its strongest possible position for contesting American control of the waterway itself. Now let's trace the actual pattern of strikes, because this is where the story really comes into focus. The first confirmed strike on Qeshm came remarkably early in the war. According to the Wikipedia entry documenting the incident directly, on March 7, 2026, in the opening days of what's now formally tracked as the 2026 Iran War, Iran accused the United States of attacking a freshwater desalination plant on Keshum Island. Iran said the strike disrupted water supplies to 30 separate villages, a real documented humanitarian consequence, sitting alongside the unresolved question of exactly who was actually responsible for causing it. Both the United States and Israel denied carrying out that specific attack. Iran's foreign minister at the time told CBS News that the U.S. had struck the desalination plant, while separately, the United Arab Emirates was accused of carrying out retaliatory strikes on that same facility, an accusation the UAE itself firmly denied, stating it would never place the Iranian people in the same basket as the Iranian regime. The UAE went further, directly criticizing Israeli media and what it called a senior Israeli source for spreading what it described as rumors about the actions of another sovereign state. That opening incident is worth sitting with on its own because it establishes something important about how confused and contested even the earliest strikes on this island were. 3 different possible culprits, the United States, Israel, and the UAE, each either denying involvement or being denied involvement by another party entirely. A civilian desalination plant, not a military target, affecting water access for 30 villages, and a public diplomatic dispute breaking out between the UAE and Israeli media over who was actually responsible. That's a genuinely messy, disputed opening chapter, and it's worth remembering as the baseline, because what followed became progressively less disputed and considerably more confirmed as the war ground on. The next confirmed round came in early July, roughly 4 months later, following what appears to have been a period of relative calm around this specific island compared to the intensity that would follow only days afterward. According to CBS News' live coverage from that period, projectiles struck a location on Keshum Island on a Monday evening, with the Hormozgan governor's office directly attributing the strike to what it called the American enemy, according to Iran's IRIB state broadcaster. That same report noted explosions of unknown origin near Bandar Abbas and Keshum that same day, with the semi-official Mehr news agency describing the blasts as appearing to come from the west coast of Bandar Abbas. Notably, this round of strikes came even as Iran was continuing active diplomatic talks with mediators from Qatar, Pakistan, and Oman, with an Iranian foreign ministry spokesman explicitly stating that Tehran would pursue diplomacy alongside military measures, using both tools simultaneously depending on what circumstances required. Just days later, the pattern repeated again, and this time, the connection to a specific triggering incident became much clearer than it had been during that first disputed round back in March. According to CNN's live reporting from July 11th, explosions hit multiple coastal areas near the Strait of Hormuz, including Qeshm Island specifically, which CNN's own reporting described directly as Iran's largest island in the Persian Gulf, and part of its arch defense near the strait. Those strikes came immediately after the U.S. said it had targeted Iran in response to Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces striking a Cyprus-flagged container ship that had been transiting the strait through what the IRGC claimed was an unauthorized route. That same CNN report documented a much wider regional response, happening simultaneously across multiple separate countries. The IRGC launching what it called retaliatory strikes on Prince Hassan Air Base in Jordan, the UAE responding to missile and drone threats, Bahrain activating air raid sirens and ordering residents to shelter, and Qatar's Ministry of Defense intercepting a missile attack aimed at the country itself. 2 days after that, the strikes hit Qeshm again for a third confirmed time within the same short stretch of July, showing just how quickly this specific cycle of strike and counterstrike was accelerating during that particular week. According to CNN's reporting from July 13th, the U.S. launched a third consecutive night of strikes across a broad swath of Iran, with Iranian media reporting explosions in Bandar Abbas and on the islands of Kish, Qeshm, and Abu Musa, 3 of the 7 islands making up Iran's own arch defense concept, all hit within the same night. That same report documented Iran's own retaliation, drone strikes targeting communication systems, fuel tanks, a Patriot air defense system, a watchtower, and an ammunition depot at what Iran described as a U.S. military base in Kuwait, explicitly framed by Iran's army as a response to what it called repeated U.S. aggression. The economic ripple effects were immediate and severe. Brent crude, the global oil benchmark, surged 9.5% that same day, settling at $83.30 a barrel, its highest closing level since June 12th, and its biggest single-day percentage gain in more than 6 years. Iranian missiles also hit 2 UAE-flagged tankers in the Strait that same day, killing 1 crew member according to the UAE's own defense ministry. By July 15th, according to CNN's continuing coverage, the U.S. military had completed a second wave of strikes specifically aimed at degrading Iran's ability to target vessels in the Strait, with early morning attacks that same day specifically targeting an island near the Strait of Hormuz. That same report confirmed the naval blockade was now fully underway, with the U.S. military disabling an empty oil tanker that had been sailing toward Kharg Island, Iran's critical economic lifeline for oil exports. Air defenses activated in parts of Tehran itself that same period, with a resident telling CNN they'd been woken by a loud explosion. Even as an Iranian foreign ministry spokesperson stated, Tehran had no plans for negotiations with the United States at that specific moment. The following day brought the most significant single expansion of the entire campaign to that point. According to France 24's live coverage from July 16th, the United States ramped up its attacks on Iran that Thursday, reportedly striking near Keshum Island once again, while also hitting targets farther north, including strikes around Tehran itself for the first time in this specific round of fighting. That same report captured White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt's public justification for the entire campaign, stating directly that Iran had violated the memorandum of understanding both sides had signed, specifically the provision that Iran would not fire on commercial vessels moving through the strait, something Leavitt said Iran had unfortunately made the tragic decision to do anyway. France 24 described the two countries as trading blows for a 6th consecutive day at that point, battling over control of the strait despite mediator Pakistan's calls to resume talks, with the renewed fighting and blockade coming just a month after a preliminary deal had been signed specifically to end the conflict. That same period saw President Trump make one of his more revealing public statements about what the end game of all this strait-focused fighting actually looked like from the American side, a statement that arguably explains the entire logic behind the repeated strikes on Keshum better than any single military justification could. According to CBS News' coverage, Trump told Fox News the United States was going to keep the strait and would probably run it, describing America as becoming what he called the guardian of the strait, floating the name guardian angel of the strait, and stating repeatedly across multiple points in the same interview that the U.S. should be reimbursed for providing that security. That's about as direct a statement of intent as you're likely to find in this entire war. An American president describing, in his own words, an ambition to functionally run and get paid for securing a waterway that Iran has spent decades insisting belongs under its own sovereign control, a claim Tehran has never formally abandoned, even as the practical reality on the water has shifted considerably over the course of this specific conflict. Now, let's get into the actual numbers behind the blockade itself, because this is where the abstract idea of losing control turns into something you can actually measure. According to reporting compiled by the International Crisis Group's own tracker on the Strait of Hormuz flashpoint, U.S. Central Command reported that its forces had redirected 94 commercial vessels and disabled 4 more while enforcing the blockade, specifically to prevent the flow of commerce into and out of Iranian ports. 94 ships redirected, 4 disabled outright. That's not a symbolic gesture or an occasional interception happening once in a while for show. That's a sustained, large-scale interdiction operation, actively reshaping how global shipping traffic moves through one of the most economically important waterways on the entire planet, over Iran's own stated objections and formal diplomatic protests. Think about what redirecting 94 separate commercial vessels actually requires operationally, because it's a genuinely enormous undertaking. Each one of those ships represents a separate interaction, identifying the vessel, communicating with its crew and its owning company, verifying its cargo and destination, and physically altering its course, all while maintaining enough naval presence throughout the strait to make that redirection order credible rather than simply ignored. Doing that 94 separate times isn't a single dramatic operation. It's a sustained, ongoing administrative and military effort, repeated day after day, week after week, across months of active blockade enforcement. That's the kind of operational tempo that only makes sense if the force conducting it genuinely believes it has the practical authority to make those redirection orders stick. And the fact that CENTCOM is willing to publish those numbers as an accomplishment tells you it believes exactly that. That same tracker documented a specific strike directly on Keshum that adds yet another confirmed incident to the list. Central Command reported that its forces had shot down 3 one-way attack drones launched by Iran toward civilian mariners, and separately, that American forces had conducted what CENTCOM described as self-defense strikes on an Iranian military ground control station on Qeshm Island. Iran responded to that specific exchange by launching missiles and drones at Kuwait and Bahrain, but according to CENTCOM's own account, all of those Iranian projectiles failed to hit their intended targets. The IRGC, for its part, announced it had retaliated with strikes against 85 separate locations tied to important U. military facilities in Bahrain and Kuwait, while Iran's parliamentary speaker made his own competing claims about the broader exchange. Notice the specific asymmetry embedded in that exchange, according to CENTCOM's own telling. American strikes on Qeshm's ground control station are described as having happened. Iran's retaliatory missiles and drones toward Kuwait and Bahrain are described by the same American command as having entirely failed to hit their intended targets. Whether that's the complete picture or a favorably framed one from the American side is a fair question, and it's worth holding on to that skepticism. But it's also worth noting that this same pattern, confirmed American strikes landing, Iranian retaliation, failing to land, showed up repeatedly across the reporting we've walked through tonight, from the earliest CENTCOM statements all the way through the most recent exchanges. There's also a fascinating legal and administrative dimension to this fight that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage of the war. And it's worth including here because it shows Iran fighting for control of the strait through paperwork and declared boundaries, not just through missiles. According to that same International Crisis Group tracker, Iran's own Persian Gulf Strait Authority has claimed a specific definition for what it calls the Strait of Hormuz Management Supervision Area, describing it as the line connecting Mount Mubarak in Iran and southern Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates on the eastern side of the strait, extending to the line connecting the end of Keshum Island in Iran and al-Quwain in the United Arab Emirates on the western side. That's Iran formally asserting a specific, bureaucratically defined zone of authority over the strait, anchored explicitly at Keshum Island itself, even as American naval forces were actively redirecting and disabling commercial vessels throughout that exact same stretch of contested water. Two competing claims of authority over the identical stretch of ocean, one enforced through CENTCOM's actual warships patrolling the water day and night, the other asserted only through an Iranian regulatory declaration that has no functional practical ability to actually stop an American interdiction from happening in real time. It's worth understanding why a government under this much direct military pressure would still bother publishing a detailed bureaucratic boundary declaration like that one, rather than simply abandoning the paperwork entirely. Formal, documented claims of administrative authority serve a long-term legal and diplomatic purpose that outlasts any single military campaign. Even if Iran cannot currently enforce that declared boundary against an active American blockade, maintaining the formal claim preserves a legal argument Iran can point back to in any future negotiation, international court proceeding, or diplomatic settlement, asserting continuity of its own stated authority regardless of what actually happened on the water during the war itself. That's a government playing a longer game than just the current military balance of power, banking on the idea that formal claims, maintained consistently over time, carry weight even through periods where they can't be physically enforced. That gap between Iran's formal declared claim of administrative authority and the actual physical reality of American warships redirecting and disabling vessels at will is close to the cleanest possible illustration of what losing control of a strategic waterway actually looks like in real time. It doesn't require Iran to formally renounce its claim. It doesn't require a treaty or a surrender. It simply requires one side's paper authority to keep existing on the books, while the other side's naval and air power determines what actually happens on the water day to day. By that measure, the numbers CENTCOM itself has published, 94 vessels redirected, 4 disabled, repeated strikes on the islands, making up Iran's own arch defense, tell a fairly unambiguous story about which side has been setting the actual terms of passage through this strait for months now. Now let's get to the most recent chapter, because it's only days old, and it shows this entire cycle intensifying rather than winding down. According to reporting on the ceasefire's collapse in late July, Washington had paused its bombing campaign for a period, but Iran continued striking American forces regardless. On July 28th, Iran hit Al-Azraq Air Base in Jordan. Washington then resumed its bombing campaign in direct response, including the strike on Keshum on July 29th that opened this video tonight, the one that killed a father, a mother, and their 2-year-old son, and wounded 2 more children. Hormozgan provincial official Ahmad Nafisi identified those killed by name, speaking on the record rather than through anonymous state media channels, Qaisar Jafari, his wife Zara, and their son Sina. CENTCOM characterized that assault as a powerful response to Iranian strikes on U.S. forces stationed across the wider region, describing it as part of the same military network the United States had used to open the war back on February 28th under the name Operation Epic Fury, a name that has carried through nearly every phase of this conflict since. Iran's response to that specific strike came fast, within the same general news cycle, and it included a claim that deserves genuine scrutiny rather than automatic repetition, exactly the kind of claim that separates careful war reporting from simply amplifying whichever side spoke loudest that day. According to that same reporting, Iran answered with another strike on Al-Azraq, the exact Jordanian base the United States had used to launch its bombing run on Keshum. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed that strike destroyed 3 F-35 fighter jets, damaged 3 more, and hit the maintenance shed those aircraft depend on to keep flying. Here's why that claim needs to be treated carefully rather than simply repeated as fact. Throughout this entire war, Iran has made a documented pattern of dramatic battlefield claims that didn't hold up under independent scrutiny, from repeated assertions of striking the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, each one directly denied by CENTCOM within the same news cycle, to other claims of major hits that outside verification never confirmed. A claim of destroying 3 F-35 stealth fighters and damaging 3 more at a specific named base is exactly the kind of dramatic, propaganda-valuable assertion that fits Iran's established pattern of announcements throughout this conflict. As of the most recent available reporting, this specific F-35 claim comes from Iranian state-aligned sources and hasn't been independently confirmed by CENTCOM or by any neutral third party. That doesn't make it automatically false. Strikes on air bases do happen, and aircraft do get damaged in wars, but given Iran's own track record of unverified claims throughout this exact conflict, this specific assertion belongs in the same category of caution as those earlier carrier claims, worth reporting as a claim, not worth repeating as a confirmed fact. Think about what it would actually take to verify a claim like this one properly, because that's exactly the kind of evidence that's currently missing. Confirming the destruction of 3 F-35 stealth fighters at a specific base would typically involve some combination of satellite imagery showing wreckage or scorch marks at known aircraft parking positions, independent statements from Jordanian officials who would have direct knowledge of damage to a base on their own sovereign territory, or eventual acknowledgement from the U.S. Air Force itself, which maintains detailed records of its own airframe losses, regardless of how politically inconvenient those losses might be to admit. None of those 3 forms of independent verification appear in the currently available reporting on this specific claim. That absence doesn't prove the claim false, but it does mean the honest, accurate way to present it is exactly as what it currently is, an Iranian claim awaiting verification, not an established fact. It's also worth remembering just how costly an F-35 loss would actually be, in a way that makes independent confirmation even more likely to eventually surface if the claim is accurate. Each F-35 represents an investment in the tens of millions of dollars, and the loss of 3 destroyed and 3 more damaged in a single strike would represent one of the most significant single engagement losses of advanced American airframes in this entire war. A loss of that magnitude would be extraordinarily difficult to keep concealed indefinitely, given how closely defense analysts, satellite imagery providers, and journalists have been tracking every other major loss throughout this conflict. If this claim is accurate, independent confirmation is more likely than not to eventually surface. Its absence so far, in the days immediately following the claim, is itself a data point worth weighing, even as the story remains genuinely unresolved as of this recording. So let's pull this all together into the actual picture, because it's more nuanced than either a simple story of American dominance or a simple story of Iranian resistance holding firm. Keshum Island, the largest island in the Persian Gulf and the anchor of Iran's own arch defense concept for the Strait of Hormuz, has now been struck at least 6 separate times since this war began in early March. From the disputed desalination plant strike in the war's opening days, through the confirmed ground control station strike and the deadly July 29th attack on a family's home. The broader blockade around the strait is not just rhetorical, it's measured in specific numbers. 94 commercial vessels redirected and 4 disabled, according to CENTCOM's own reporting. Iran's own declared administrative authority over the strait, anchored explicitly at Keshum's own coastline, continues to exist on paper even as American forces determine the practical reality of what moves through that water and what doesn't. And the most recent exchange, a lethal strike on a Keshum family followed by an Iranian claim of destroying multiple F-35s that remains unverified, shows this specific cycle, strike, retaliation, dramatic claim, continuing to repeat itself even 5 months into the war, with no clear sign of either side's underlying position fundamentally shifting. Whether that adds up to Iran definitively losing control of the strait in some final, permanent sense, or whether it's simply the latest chapter in a much longer contest that's been running since February, is a fair question to leave open rather than answer with false confidence. What isn't in serious dispute, based on everything we've walked through tonight, is that the practical, day-to-day authority over which ships move through this waterway, and under what conditions, has increasingly sat with American naval power rather than with the Iranian regulatory boundary drawn on paper around Keshum's own coastline. It's worth stepping back and considering what would actually need to change for that trajectory to reverse itself. Iran would need to demonstrate a sustained ability to reliably strike back at the American naval and air assets enforcing the blockade, something its own retaliatory strikes have struggled to do consistently, according to CENTCOM's own repeated characterizations of failed intercepts and missed targets throughout this war. It would need international shipping companies to lose confidence in the safety of following American-directed routing, rather than the reverse, which appears to be the current trend given the sheer number of vessels that have already been successfully redirected without major incident. And it would need Iran's own declared administrative boundary to translate into something with actual enforcement teeth, rather than remaining a formal claim sitting alongside a physical reality shaped by someone else's warships. None of those three shifts appear to be underway as of the most recent reporting, which is exactly why the trend line documented throughout tonight's video points in the direction it does. What do you think happens next for this specific island and the broader fight over the strait surrounding it? Does the pattern of repeated strikes on Keshum eventually force a genuine shift in who controls that waterway? Or does Iran's continued strikes on bases like Al-Azraq show its own capacity to keep contesting that control indefinitely, regardless of how many times Keshum itself gets hit? Let me know what you think in the comments. Every claim in this video traces back to named verifiable reporting, the Wikipedia entry documenting the March 7th desalination plant strike, and the competing accusations that followed. CBS News' live coverage of the July blockade and Trump's own comments on running the strait, CNN's live coverage across July 11th, 13th, and 15th, documenting the repeated strikes on Keshum and the surrounding islands, France 24's coverage of the July 16th expansion of strikes toward Tehran, the International Crisis Group's detailed tracker on the Strait of Hormuz flashpoint, documenting CENTCOM's blockade numbers in Iran's own declared administrative boundary, and reporting on the July 28th and 29th exchange, including the named victims of the Keshum strike and Iran's unverified claim regarding F-35 losses at Al-Azraq, where a claim came from Iranian state-aligned sources without independent confirmation, including the F-35 destruction claim. That status was preserved clearly rather than folded into the broader narrative as settled fact, because a story about who actually controls a strategic waterway only means something if every individual claim inside it holds up to the same standard. That standard matters most of all for the family named in tonight's opening, because their deaths are not a disputed claim requiring the same caution as a battlefield propaganda assertion. Qaisar Jafari, his wife Zara, and their 2-year-old son Sina were confirmed killed by a named provincial official speaking on the record, a different category of fact entirely from an unverified claim of downed fighter jets circulating through state media. Keeping that distinction clear between what's been confirmed through named officials and what remains an unverified assertion from either side is exactly what separates an honest account of this war from one that simply repeats whichever claim sounds most dramatic in the moment.